But the question that I want to raise is about what Westphalia is actually supposed to invoke here. There has been a revisionist literature within international relations and political science challenging the idea that Westphalia actually did any of the things that people commonly suggest that it did. My sense with that is, yes, I think that was fine as a challenge, but I think that too fails to recognise what it was that Westphalia actually did, what the Westphalian treaties, plural, actually said, what they were designed to get at. And one of the things that I think is most interesting in the Westphalia treaties is where the polities within the Holy Roman Empire are given the free exercise of territorial right. Jus territorialis, or in the German translations, Landeshoheit, which wouldn't quite translate as territorial sovereignty, but is a notion of a sort of supremacy or a rule over land. Now, if that question then today of state and sovereignty coming apart is important, the question that I think also needs to be raised is, can we have a better understanding of how they first came together? And I think that that would be a very interesting layer to put into the kind of histories of sovereignty, the histories of political thought, to actually ask much more explicitly about the territorial dimension to those histories, about how the relation between power and place can be understood perhaps in more general terms. Most literature on sovereignty, most historical literature on sovereignty, often neglects the question of what that sovereignty is actually over, and particularly that spatial dimension of it. So to go back to that first point that I made, if this idea of exclusive sovereignty within a territory is a question that needs to be thought about today, I think the idea that it was exclusive sovereignty is a much older idea than the idea that the territory within which it operated was fixed. I think you can go back to the idea of exclusive sovereignty within a territory quite a long way back, and there's earlier precedents in the 13th, 14th century, it seems to me. The idea that those boundaries of that state or that polity would be fixed is a much later idea. So how did they come together if at the moment we're seeing them being pulled apart? So there's historical questions, like Raya was saying. The third point that I want to mention briefly is the notion of flows, something that Wendy alluded to in the talk, about the questions of circulation, about routing of people and goods along particular routes, where there's walls being built in some areas, but not in other areas. Most of these walls, of course, have gates in them, both for the security personnel, but also to regulate and control the flows that's going on. The dam was used as an illustration right at the end, and opening and blocking was one of the paradoxes that Wendy mentioned. Now, this is something that goes beyond simply walls, of course. You can see this in the way that canals become a strategic point in terms of the regulation of flow, passage of goods, particularly oil. But the wars that were fought over Suez, over Panama, the strategic importance that's put on places like the Straits of Hormuz or the Straits of Malacca, the idea of these strategic choke points, which can be both for people and goods in that sense, but also more generally. But this also raises a question of temporality, about how actually now, particularly in Israel-Palestine, places that were previously very close together have now become very far apart in terms of the ways that you can actually access these. Either that you have to wait until the wall is open for passage, or that if the wall is entirely closed in some places, that you have to take a much longer and circuitous route to get to the place that you want to get to. Of families being cut off from each other, from healthcare, from farmland, from jobs, etc. So the temporal aspect to this, as well as the spatial division, I think is something that's worth thinking about. And the final aspect is an aspect of the materiality of these walls that I think Wendy illustrated so well, particularly through the illustrations. But it's to think about height, or it's to think about the question of verticality. And if you look at the height of these different walls, if you compare, for instance, the Berlin Wall to the Israel Wall, the difference in height is really quite striking in terms of these. But I think that for far too long, geographers and others have thought about territory as an area, as two-dimensional. And I want to raise the question of territory as a volume, something that has three dimensions. To think about the way that walls are built to try and prevent a passage across two dimensions, but have a verticality that has issues in terms of the things that can be thrown over or that can be passed over these, but also tunnelling, so the underneath, the subsoil, as a question around these things. And this is again a wider issue, particularly in Israel-Palestine. The call of Ariel Sharon and others that the Israeli settlers should go to the hilltops because these are strategically important sites. Eyal Weissman's fantastic book, Hollow Land, where he's looking at the particular kinds of vertical stratification that's going on through the occupation. The commonly used example is the roads. You would have a Palestinian road snaking through the valley floor, and then an Israeli superhighway going across the top of it. Again, a question of temporality, of how long it gets for places. Clinton's plans in 2000 for the Temple Mount, that you could have Palestinian sovereignty on the top, where the Dome of the Rock is, but you would have Israeli sovereignty going underneath into the tunnels that were there for the previous Jewish temple, so that you wouldn't have the sovereignties over territory abutting like this, but like this. The question of verticality is one that I'm getting interested in, particularly in terms of the recent book by Peter Sloterdijk translated into English. The German title would be Luftbeben, so air quakes or air tremors, like earthquakes. The English translation is terror from the air. But there he looks at the ways in which aerial bombardment, the taking over the atmosphere of poison gas, for instance, challenge the ways that states think about their sovereignty. And there was the concern over bombers, because these could transcend the boundaries between states, that the bomber would always get through. The cruise missiles in the Cold War is adding a new kind of vulnerability to the questions of how the state thought about itself. And I think it's no coincidence that in the War on Terror, two of the most extreme responses from the US and from Israel were to aerial bombardment. The attacks of September 11th, 2001, but also the Katyusha rockets coming over from Lebanon into Israel. But both the responses, of course, were responses from the air. The aerial bombardment in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also the response of Israel in bombing southern Lebanon and Beirut. So that wars divide horizontally, but they also raise for me questions of verticality. I'll stop there.
Thank you, that was wonderful. I mean, not adding, but pulling out questions of time and history, space and territory, materiality, and I now understand verticality, to the analysis. Wonderful. I now want to... Do you want to respond immediately, or shall we open it up?
No, I'll mix it in.
Yeah, mix it in. Okay. We have two lovely assistants, strolling up and down. If you... I mean... It's now open for questions, comments. I think we'll collect a few and then ask anyone on the panel to respond. If you can say who you are and wait for the microphone to come to you then. So I'm looking for hands here. Okay. Collect a few more hands, yeah, Jeff.
Bob Kelly, Politics and International Studies, the Open University. I find it quite interesting, your idea that the walls and the building of walls actually is a symbol of the weakness and vulnerability of states. But having just had an arduous journey driving from Strasbourg to Bratislava, I'd look at it the other way, that the absence of walls between those countries on that route shows the confidence of the state and its ability to benefit from passing motorists, individuals, groups, whatever, and its ability to control if it felt the need to. In fact, the only walls of significance were built by governments to segregate the road and its bad effects from the neighbouring communities in terms, I think, of noise and pollution. I don't know how far you'd agree that that is a sort of double edge. Yes, the walls show a weakness, but a lack of walls can show the continuation of state power and potential state sovereignty.
Okay, next one's here, Jeff.
Thanks, Wendy. That was excellent. I'm Jeff Huismans. I'm also in Politics and International Studies here. It was very comprehensive, so I had a real difficulty getting some kind of thing in that wasn't actually said. But that was because, in a way, and it's the way you treat walls. It's really fascinating how it all comes together. It covers the whole register of the way of things I've seen being written about it and bringing it together coherently. One thing I was missing a little bit is how the walls themselves can be read as sides of politics. I was thinking in terms that you have walls as the manifestation of sovereignty, but you can see walls also as indeed what they probably are meant to do sometimes, is the institution or identification of sites of battle or sites of struggle. Because in a way it would actually give the immigrants you refer to, or the people who traverse borders, a kind of more political meaning, that they are part of the game about what the wall is. That is, therefore, it's an element of a marking of spaces of struggle. And what the struggle is about then shifts quite dramatically. It's different between North and South Korea, as it is, for example, for your Minutemen, because when you hinted at them, you said it's about a critique of liberalism in the US. So that seems to be that the border sits in a kind of different struggle. It's not just a manifestation of the state, it's also a critique or a politics of what does it mean liberal, what are the limits of liberalism, what are the possibilities of liberalism.